Hello everyone, and welcome once again to the Temple Institute Parsha class. My name is Gedalia Meyer, and I'm podcasting from Ma'ale Adumim in Israel. When we think of history, what comes to mind? We might think of the World Wars or the Depression. We might go back further and think of the Industrial Revolution or the American Civil War. We might reach back to the Renaissance or the Middle Ages. Those who are familiar may peel off the fog of the so-called Dark Ages or go even further with classical Rome or Greece. We could go back to ancient Egypt or the invention of writing, prehistoric periods, or even the origin of human beings. History is such a vast endeavor, as anybody who's dipped their feet into its huge oceans knows. It really has no end, since any given subject has ramifications and causes that stretch out infinitely in all directions. To explore the bubonic plague of the 14th century means to touch on social networks of the period, the history of the plague through the millennia, the helplessness of everybody in the face of catastrophe, and the vast consequences of its aftermath. There is medicine, literature, art, war, and cultural changes, to name but a few of the avenues. Any period of history is really the opening of an entire universe of ideas. When it comes to religions, we see the same thing on steroids. Every religious movement contains within it all the signs of the times and leaves as a legacy the future course of humanity. The religion may no longer be around today. It may be as dead as the ancient Roman Empire, but its after effects linger on in one way or another, like the wetness in the ground after a strong rain. Whatever the religion, it has left its historical mark on the world, either localized or in some global form. Each one has bequeathed to the collective human mind the powerful remnants of belief. Judaism is certainly no exception to this. If anything, the Jews have a rightful claim to the greatest influence of all on the subsequent course of the world. From its biblical origins with the Israelites and before, to the almost worldwide reach of the diaspora, Judaism has been virtually everywhere and always. How many other religions can claim a 3,000-year-old history, let alone still surviving and thriving today? How many can claim to have spawned either directly or indirectly the two biggest religions in the world today, with all their vast histories and influences on the world? Only Judaism has managed to remain out of the stories of the Bible and the world of ancient Egypt, Persia, Greece, and Rome. Hinduism has endured almost as long, but its sphere of influence was largely contained to one area. Everything else is an offshoot of something. Judaism's longevity is one of the great mysteries of history. No ancient historian could have possibly predicted this. Even somebody a few hundred years ago would have trouble believing that Judaism would survive until today. Nobody can really explain what secret lies at the source of its eternal presence. Is it something in its teachings? Was it forced upon the Jews by outside powers? Was it the Jews themselves who drove it on for no other reason than stubbornness? Was it fate? Was it God? It would be nice if there was some straightforward answer to this question. Maybe some biblical prophecy or some genetic trait that somehow explains everything. But there is none, and the mystery remains a mystery. The Jews themselves have never really sought an answer to this question. They are somehow satisfied with simply still being around through the thick and thin. They look at the strange situation as the most natural thing in the world. Where were they supposed to go anyway? Were they supposed to vanish into nothingness like so much else did? What's the fun in that? This week's Parsha is called Balak. That word is the name of a person, one of the handful of times that a Parsha is named after someone. In this case, it was the name of an otherwise obscure Moabite king whose chief fame comes from the fact that he ruled at precisely the time that the Israelites were making their way up the eastern spine of the Holy Land. Moab, the land that he ruled, was right smack in the middle of that journey. He sensed that his land and his nation were highly vulnerable to the turmoil of war that was springing up in the wake of the Israelites. Even though the nation of Moab had been specifically excluded from the lands that the Israelites were either permitted or commanded to conquer, he appears to have been unsure of any such instructions. In addition to any other preparations he made in advance of the Israelite push, he hired the services of a nearby sorcerer to handle the heavenly side of things. He wasn't leaving anything to chance, so he did the biblically wise move of cursing their fate through one who had an impressive track record of successful cursing. This man's name was Bilaam, And he is the primary subject of our parsha, even though fate would have it that it wasn't named after him. After a somewhat hesitant start to the whole procedure of getting set up for the cursing, Balak and Bilaam situate themselves in various strategic positions to gain the most effectiveness for their goal. Balak saw Balaam as nothing other than a hired mercenary who happened to be skilled in sorcery. Balaam, for his part, repeatedly insists that he can do nothing other than what is put into the mouth by none other than God. Even though he is clearly sympathetic to Balak's goals, and Jewish tradition sees him as even more enthusiastic than Balak was, he senses that he is constrained by the heavenly power represented by the divine. In other words, these were not mere words he was uttering to simply get the curse over with and collect his fee. He was a serious sorcerer who only did things according to the will of the higher power he worked through. If God didn't approve, he could do nothing. They go through 3 of these vantage points, and on each one, Balaam succeeds not in cursing the Israelites, but in blessing them. Each time, Balak berates him for not abiding by the plan. And each time, Balaam reminds Balak that he could only utter the words that God put in his mouth. He was not a freelancer who could say whatever he wished. After the 3rd round, Balak finally gets frustrated and sends him packing without any of the honor he had promised him. When Balaam repeats his constraints, he then continues his prophetic utterances without any prompting from Balak. This final round seems to be uncalled for, even beyond the control of Balaam himself. He prophesies about the fate of many nations. Quote, "I see it, but not now. I perceive it, but not in the near future. A star shall go forth from Jacob, and a staff shall arise in Israel, crushing all of Moab's princes and dominating all of Seth's descendants. Edom shall be demolished, and his enemy Seir destroyed, but Israel shall be triumphant. Out of Jacob shall descend one who will obliterate the city's last survivors." He saw Amalek and proclaimed his message and said, "First among nations is Amalek, but his end is to be destroyed." He saw the Kenites and proclaimed his message and said, "You live in a fortress and have placed your nest in a cliff. But when the time comes to destroy the Kenites, how long will Assyria hold back from you?" He then proclaimed his message and said, "Woe, who can survive God's devastation? Warships shall come from the ports of the Kittim, and they will lay waste to Assyria and Eber, and in the end they too shall be destroyed forever." These prophecies are not easy to understand or to hear once understood. They speak of utter destruction of entire nations. They talk of war and obliteration of cities, of fortresses destroyed, of domination and crushing enemies. These are classic biblical prophecies, counted among the most important messages of the entire Bible. Although they were spoken by a sorcerer who was the enemy of the Israelites, they are regarded as if uttered by God. All of these nations have vanished. Most were obliterated so long ago that almost nobody has ever heard of them. The 1 or 2 that are still known are only so because of passages like these in the Bible. Where did all these nations go? Why aren't they still around somewhere? Surely there are people today who are direct descendants of these very nations. The DNA is still in circulation, but the nation itself is no more alive than a ruined stone structure buried in the Middle Eastern desert. Where did they go? The single one that still exists is Israel. Only Israel is singled out in this dramatic prophecy as having, quote, "a star come forth and a staff arising from." Only Israel shall be triumphant out of all this destruction. Only out of Jacob shall one descend who will witness the destruction of the others. What are we to take out of biblical prophecies like this? Should they be ignored and written off as nothing more than biblical nonsense, ranted by madmen who occasionally got lucky with their predictions? Possibly, but there's another possibility. Perhaps, just perhaps, these prophecies somehow hit on some bit of fate that slipped through the cracks. How this was supposed to work is totally unknown, but somehow they managed to strike into the truth of the future. Even if we say they were written after the fact, that 2,500 odd years ago, somebody wrote them down after all this had already happened. Still, we have to wonder how it is that Israel, of all subsequent nations of the ancient world, managed to survive. Is this some sort of self-fulfilling prophecy that once uttered, the Israelites and their heirs, the Jews, somehow felt compelled to make happen? Even if we opt for this approach, we have to wonder how things worked out in this way. Did the Jews have some miraculous power over fate that allowed them to defy the forces of history and survive against all odds? If we are going to resort to something like this, we might as well say that the prophecies are real. At some point, it may become necessary to actually recognize that something strange is going on with the history of this remarkable people. They seem to possess an ability to escape the scourges of history and always emerge from whatever turmoil is thrown their way. Whether it be exile from their homeland, diaspora around the world, perpetual oppression and pogroms, forced conversion, ghettos, a Holocaust, the Jews always come out alive. What is their staying power? Can anybody explain this? Is there anything in the vast and complex study of human history that can possibly solve the puzzle of the survival of the Jews? Shabbat Shalom.